Stop scrolling right now, because what you're about to hear sounds like the opening scene of a financial thriller, except this isn't fiction. This is the kind of shift that doesn't explode onto your screen with breaking news banners. It happens quietly, behind closed doors, buried in technical language, while almost nobody notices, until the consequences start spreading. Something unusual has been happening in the financial arteries of North America. No dramatic speeches, no emergency press conferences, just a subtle but deeply symbolic change in behavior, one that has left seasoned observers asking an uncomfortable question. Are we witnessing the early signs of a structural fracture inside one of the world's most tightly integrated economic regions? For decades, the economic relationship between the United States and Canada was treated as a given, stable, predictable, almost automatic. Trade flowed across the border, capital moved with ease, supply chains intertwined so deeply that many industries effectively functioned as if the border barely existed. The phrase North American economy wasn't just rhetoric, it reflected reality. But history teaches us something critical. Systems rarely collapse overnight. They drift, strain, crack, and realign long before the general public realizes anything fundamental has changed. And sometimes, those early signals appear in the most unexpected place of all, the bond market. To understand why this matters, we need to step away from headlines and political noise and focus on something that sounds dry but is anything but: government borrowing. When a government needs money, whether national, provincial, or state level, it issues bonds. In simple terms, a bond is an IOU. Investors lend money, the government promises repayment with interest. That's it. Straightforward on the surface. But beneath that simplicity lies an entire ecosystem of power, influence, and financial hierarchy. Because governments don't just borrow money, they borrow through institutions, through banks, through underwriting syndicates, through networks that determine who gets access, who earns fees, who gains relationships, and who accumulates strategic influence. For a very long time, the largest American banks sat at the center of this universe. Wall Street didn't merely participate, it dominated. Major debt offerings from around the world often passed through U.S. financial giants. These banks structured deals, underwrote bonds, distributed securities to global investors, and collected enormous fees in the process. It became normal, expected, institutionalized. And Canada, despite its own sophisticated banking sector, frequently relied on this machinery, especially for large international bond issuances. That arrangement made sense in an era defined by deep globalization. The US dollar reigned supreme. American financial markets offered unmatched liquidity. Wall Street institutions possessed global reach and prestige. Participation was not just practical, it was perceived as necessary. But now, subtle deviations from that pattern are raising eyebrows. In recent high-profile bond transactions, major Canadian provincial borrowers chose an unexpected path. Instead of leaning on the traditional Wall Street heavyweights, they turned toward domestic banks and select international players outside the United States. No formal declaration accompanied the move, no dramatic language. Yet, in financial terms, the message resonated loudly. Because in global finance, who you choose and who you exclude speaks volumes. This wasn't simply an administrative reshuffle, it was a decision embedded with strategic implications. Bond underwriting is not just about selling debt, it is about relationships, long-term positioning, and the architecture of financial dependence. When a borrower shifts away from a long-established group of intermediaries, analysts don't shrug, they ask why. And the why leads us into a much larger story, one defined by rising economic nationalism, trade disputes, tariffs reappeared as policy tools, governments adopted more defensive postures. Supply chains, once optimized purely for efficiency, began to be evaluated through the lens of resilience and security. The United States, long the chief architect of global economic liberalization, began moving toward a more protectionist stance. Domestic industry first became a recurring theme across political cycles. Trade measures once considered extraordinary became normalized instruments of negotiation and leverage. Canada, deeply intertwined with the U.S. economy, inevitably felt the ripple effects. Tariff disputes over steel, aluminum, and other sectors introduced friction into what had long been marketed as one of the world's smoothest trading relationships. Industries dependent on cross-border stability found themselves navigating uncertainty. Political rhetoric sharpened. Strategic trust, once assumed, required reassessment. And here lies a critical truth about modern economic conflict. Retaliation is rarely confined to the same battlefield. When trade channels become strained, financial channels often follow. Not necessarily through dramatic sanctions or bans, but through quieter adjustments. Diversification, risk reduction, rebalancing of institutional reliance. Seen through this lens, the bond market decisions begin to look less like isolated financial events and more like components of a broader strategic shift. Because bond markets operate on one fragile but essential ingredient: confidence. Confidence in repayment, confidence in stability, confidence in political and economic relationships. When confidence changes, even subtly, behavior changes. Borrowers diversify funding sources, governments reassess exposure, financial institutions recalibrate cross-border strategies, investors demand different risk premiums. The system doesn't crash, it gradually reshapes itself. For Wall Street, such shifts are not trivial. Underwriting major bond deals generates revenue, yes, but also something arguably more valuable: access, insight, influence, long-term positioning within a borrower's economic ecosystem. To be included is to remain embedded. To be excluded is to lose a foothold. And exclusion, even in a handful of transactions, forces uncomfortable reflection. Is this temporary, tactical, or the beginning of a trend? Zooming out further, we encounter an even bigger transformation underway, one not limited to North America. Around the world, nations are reconsidering the architecture of globalization that defined the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The era of frictionless integration, where efficiency dominated every calculation, is giving way to a more complex reality, shaped by strategic autonomy, national security concerns, and geopolitical competition. Countries are diversifying trade partners, diversifying reserve holdings, diversifying financial infrastructure, diversifying technological dependencies. What was once considered excessive caution is now framed as prudent risk management. In that environment, even small adjustments can signal profound shifts in mindset. Financial systems, after all, are not just technical frameworks. They are reflections of trust, power, and perceived stability. When a government subtly redirects its borrowing channels, it may be doing more than optimizing fees. It may be hedging against political risk, reducing strategic vulnerability, sending a message about autonomy without ever issuing a formal statement. For the broader economy, these dynamics carry complex implications. Financial fragmentation can introduce inefficiencies. Capital may not flow as seamlessly. Cross-border projects may face additional layers of uncertainty. Companies may duplicate operations rather than rely on deeply integrated continental supply chains. Efficiency yields to resilience. Cost structures shift. Investment decisions become more cautious. And ultimately, those changes filter down to businesses, workers, and consumers. Prices, jobs, growth trajectories. None of this happens instantly. There is no single dramatic moment where a narrator announces everything has changed. Instead, the transformation unfolds incrementally. A tariff here, a regulatory adjustment there, a supply chain relocation, a bond syndicate reshuffle, a change in reserve allocation. Individually, each move seems manageable, technical, even boring. Collectively, they redraw the map of global economic relationships. There is another dimension worth considering, one often overlooked in discussions dominated by macroeconomics and geopolitics: perception. Markets are driven not only by hard data, but by narratives, expectations, beliefs about future stability, signals interpreted through layers of psychology. If participants begin to perceive rising friction, rising uncertainty, rising politicization of economic tools, they adjust behavior, sometimes preemptively. Investors hedge, governments diversify, institutions reprice risk. Confidence doesn't collapse, it migrates. And migration of confidence is one of the most powerful forces in global finance. Because when enough actors quietly decide to reduce concentration in one system and explore alternatives, the shift becomes self-reinforcing. Liquidity patterns change, influence patterns change, strategic leverage changes. What once appeared unassailable begins to look contestable, not because of a sudden crisis, but because of gradual redistribution of trust. Does this mean the US-Canada economic relationship is collapsing? Hardly. Trade continues, capital flows continue, interdependence remains deep. But relationships do not need to collapse to evolve. They can cool, rebalance, diversify, develop new boundaries and hedging strategies. And that evolution can carry consequences just as significant as rupture. Perhaps the most important takeaway from all of this is not alarm, but awareness. Major economic transformations rarely announce themselves in ways that feel dramatic at first. They surface through patterns, visible only when one steps back from daily noise and examines the direction of change. Are countries becoming more integrated or more cautious? Are financial channels becoming more centralized or more diversified? Are trade policies becoming more liberal or more defensive? Are alliances deepening or hedging? Inside these questions lies the real story of the global economy. What we are observing may represent nothing more than tactical adjustments in a turbulent world, or it may mark the early chapters of a longer transition towards a more fragmented, multipolar financial landscape. Either way, one lesson stands out clearly. The most consequential shifts are often the quietest. They do not shout. They whisper through markets, policies, and decisions that appear technical until one day the cumulative effect becomes impossible to ignore. So the next time headlines focus your attention on dramatic political theater, remember, some of the most important battles shaping the future of the global economy are being fought far from cameras, in bond markets, capital flows, and strategic financial choices that rarely make front-page news. And by the time everyone is talking about them, they are no longer early signals.